Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Que PASA with Pan American Strategic Advisors. It used to be said that politics stopped at the water's edge. However, this has not usually been the case, and today we're seeing the ideologicalization of regional affairs coming from both the left and the right. Perhaps the most evident sign of this shift was indicated in the US's 2025 national security strategy, which laid out as part of its enlist and expand strategy an approach to reach out not only to governments in the region, but to parties and other organizations. We're seeing this play out in real time. Trump's push for regional partners to ally with him and in different countries to sway elections one way or another, the Shield of the Americas summit that was held this past March, and a counter push by leaders like Spain's Pedro Sanchez. We're also seeing this play out at the subnational level. We see parties engaging across countries from both the left and the right. We see organizations like CPAC that meet regularly to bring together right-wing politicians to have a unified voice. And we see mayors meeting with opposition in other countries as a form of subnational diplomacy. It's worth noting, though, that this is not new. We've seen the ideologicalization of regional politics in the past. UNASUR was set up during the Pink Tide as a left-wing bloc that was later replaced by a right-wing pro-Sur. Similarly, we saw the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity formed under the Biden administration and the Shield of the Americas under Trump with different political objectives, similar to those that we've seen with ALBA and other groups. The ideologicalization may result in short-term gains for individual countries or movements. However, it runs the risk of undermining long-term engagement between countries and the political pendulum swings from left to right. Today, I'm joined by two of our advisors here at PASA, Vierelina Fernandez and Ernesto Fiocchetto, to break down what the pendulum actually looks like and how the ideologicalization of politics is playing out in the Americas. Both of you, welcome and thank you for joining me for Que PASA today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So, just to kind of get the ball rolling, Latin America has, in the past couple of years, shifted starkly to the right. We've seen elections in countries like Peru, Colombia, Chile, where all these countries have swung to having more right-wing candidates. What do you guys think explains this rightward shift? And is the region really becoming more conservative?
I can start out. I would say no, I don't think the region is becoming more conservative. I think it's the natural pendulum swing of any democracy, right? To go from the right to the left. If you look at the victory margins in some of these elections or across a lot of these elections, they have been razor thin. People are talking about how, for example, Abelardo de las Priegas when in Colombia had a razor thin margin of less than 1%, right? But if you look at the victory in Peru, it was less than, I think, half a percentage point. I think it was something like 0.26%. I think it was something like 49,000 votes, right? And I think it was something similar in Honduras with Nastri Asfura, where he also won by something like less than 50,000 votes. I think it was less than a quarter percentage point. So I don't think that it's fair to characterize the region as becoming more conservative on the whole, right? I think these pendulum swings are something that we experience here in the United States and that any other country in Latin America is also going to experience because this is a natural tendency of democracy. We wouldn't want to see 40 years of a solidly right-wing bloc or left-wing, I'm sorry, or right-wing bloc or left-wing bloc. So I wouldn't say that the region is on the whole becoming more conservative. This new wave of leaders that has been elected is undoubtedly more conservative and more on the right wing end of the spectrum, but I don't think it's fair to characterize the electorate or the country as a whole in that manner.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, we have to say that the governments are turning more conservative, that for sure. Although we still have some very important countries in the region who keep like a progressive perspective, Mexico, Brazil, for example. But there is like a huge mistake if we make the conclusion that the voters are necessarily becoming conservative because they're vote as they didn't become leftist or progressive when they voted like the previous generation of governments in the in the region. So this is something that we need to clearly separate and analyze because there are different layers of this the like the same the same events. And here I think that, I mean, but so the question is why? Why are these people who are probably not ideologized, where ideology doesn't play like a big role in their everyday life, why are they voting this or that? And I think that, and then there are many layers there to analyze. I just want to bring two to the into the conversations. The first one is that I think that we have to assume that the progressive governments in Latin America, some of them or most of them didn't do a good job at some points. No, there was a lot of corruption, there was economic instability, inflation, etc., etc. But I think that most of, I mean, especially corruption. Probably I'm from Argentina and I'm thinking of my own experience and I'm transferring the experience here to this conversation. But I think that corruption was a big issue there and economy was the other one. And the first layer for me is, well, someone needs to do this job. Someone needs to take these guys out of the map, of the political map, and we need something new. So we are not voting the far right. We are voting against this corrupt layer of politicians who are not doing their job. And then I think that the other point that is very, very close to this idea of the ideologization of the region is narratives and the role of media, mass media, with narratives. No, there is like anti-progressive backlash. There's a narrative of regarding that, and I think that sometimes it's just a narrative that is not related to real facts.
I mean, you said a mouthful there, Ernesto, and there's, I think, a lot to unpack. And I want to get back to a lot of the points that you touched on. For example, the technology, the narratives that are, being pushed out there. But in terms of what is driving this rightward shift, I'm always very adamant that there are two factors that are driving it. I always say it's either security or the economy, right? And in Argentina, it was undoubtedly the economy. It was undoubtedly the hyperinflation and the triple digits. I think it got up to over 200%, 200 and something percent in Argentina. So undoubtedly that was something that was driving the rightward shift and drove the election of Javier Milei. In the rest of the region, I would say it's more the Bukele effect, more the fact that insecurity is something that has been plaguing these countries, for sure in Colombia, right? Mexico is an exception that we can talk about, right? But for sure in Colombia, the insecurity, the bombing of the Pan American Highway earlier this year, the assassination of Miguel Uribe Turbay in 2025, this pre-presidential candidate in broad daylight. I would say insecurity and the economy are the two things that are driving that. And to be a little bit more specific, I mean, this is something that I tell my students all the time. When the cause of that poverty in any of these economies is unemployment or the concentration of wealth, then it tends to drive more of a left wing swing or left wing preference. But because, for example, in Argentina, the issue was predominantly inflation, this tends to drive the electorate to vote for more right wing policies, right? Which will tend to drive down that inflation. So, yeah, I would say the economy and also insecurity, predominantly insecurity in the majority of the region, are what was driving this rightward swing, at least in my opinion.
No, no, I absolutely agree. And I'm going to add another component. I think the other one is related to nationalism and sovereignty. And there you have like the three guys in this network. No, Trump with is this hard realist politician saying, "Make America great again." No, America first. Bukele security, Milei economy. So there you have the triangle. No, the 3 points
I love
that
that.
I
Yeah.
think are shaping this ideology or this ideologization of the region.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that you guys raised. One is on the security question, but the other is on this question of delivering, right? And corruption. What's really interesting about a lot of these candidates, definitely not all of them, but several of these candidates are that they are outsider candidates as well. And I think you could point to the fact that this is not a rightward shift, but rather an outsider shift. And in many ways, the pink tide was also driven by a outsider shift, right? So we've actually seen a push for outsider anti-corruption candidates for 25 years in the region. 25 plus, right? Because you could point to Hugo Chavez and say, hey, he was elected on being that outsider candidate, or at least coming from outside of the political establishment, even though he'd been, in the spotlight because of his military career before that. The security question, I think, is really important. And Vierelina, you brought up Bukele, but What role does the changing security environment in the region play in shaping this rightward shift? Because we're seeing rises in crime not only in places where we've seen crime historically, Colombia, but certainly in some countries that have been considered extremely safe, Ecuador, Costa Rica, also countries that in the past several years have elected rightward leaning candidates.
I mean, I would say that it also is, I think, a privileged position to be able to view this from the outside and call this an ideologicalization, because for the people that are experiencing this on the ground, it's a reality that they have to live with and contend with day in and day out, right? From a very realist perspective, a very pragmatic perspective, I'm somebody who, for example, identifies as somebody who's left wing, right? And I say this to my students all the time as well. If I were in El Salvador, I would have also voted for Bukele. I would have voted for Bukele because the reality on the ground and the promises that he made, and then the reality that he delivered, right, of being the murder capital of the world and then making it a country that is now, I think, statistically as safe as Canada, right, is something that I would have voted for. So I think also to think about it in those terms, right? What does the day-to-day reality look like for these people rather than is this an ideologicalization that fits neatly into a category of right wing versus left wing, right? I think that's something that we need to consider when we think about the security situation and the changing security landscape. And of course, then that drove this massive popularity of Nayib Bukele, and then it's been replicated, as you said, in places that have historically not had these sorts of issues. So, for example, Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, who's also trying to replicate this Bukelismo, it's not really going very well for him, right? But people are still clinging to the possibility that it could perhaps work in Ecuador in the same way in which it worked in El Salvador. And when you have limited options as somebody who has limited bargaining power on the ground, right? I mean, what else do you have to vote for other than the hope that perhaps it might work in your country, despite everything saying that it's not going to work in Ecuador in the same way in which it worked in El Salvador? And there's a variety of reasons for that, which we can dive into a little bit later.
Yes, I just want to add something there. Um, I mean, there are 2 points here. I mean, first, in addition to what Vierelina said, I think that we also had this, and coming back to the idea of narratives, we also have this idea that the left is perceived as soft in crime. And in some cases, even they have become the crime themselves. No, that is partially true for sure. The problem is the generalization and the narrative created based on that, and how the narrative has been used to create insecurity within these securitization frameworks. No, so yes, security, but we don't care about human rights. Security, even if we need to um, like challenge or jeopardize the most basic freedoms of the human being. No? So we have give some governments and some political leaders like this kind of right to do whatever they want in order to be safe. I think that these security plans are, I mean, they have been good, or they have worked at some point. My question is, will that be enough, or probably better? I think that will become against themselves. No, because when you want to achieve something, and in order to achieve that, you don't care about the means, the tools that you are using. I think that you are like jeopardizing and breaking your own base.
Yeah, I agree. Long term, for example, I said I would have voted for Bukele, but long term, of course, he has consolidated power. He has broken down the democratic institutions in the country. And I agree that that's a paradox, right? But when I speak about this hierarchy of needs, if I were somebody who was terrified that her children are walking to school every single day, that her husband might not come back from, walking to his job or driving to his job because of the high levels of insecurity, I think it's a trade-off that most Latin Americans, at least in that moment, are willing to make because the mentality is survival now. And then later we'll see how we fix the problems of democracy and rebuilding these institutions. It's an imperfect trade-off. The democracy is a security
Yes.
trade-off, but I do think it's a reality.
But I don't know if you would agree with me in this bit arena, but I think that we are now in the moment in which some of these countries are like starting to think, hey, is this okay? No,
Yeah,
I'm thinking about the three governments that I mentioned, no, Trump, Bukele, and Milei. Okay, yes, we don't have inflation anymore in Argentina, but is this enough? Are we comfortable with this economic situation? People are starving, people are having problems to get a job, blah blah blah. So
yeah,
the US, make America great again. Yes, we need to build America, securitization, we close the borders, blah, blah, blah. And now, I mean, we have inflation, we are killing each other, this and that. No, I know that this is probably an oversimplification of a very complex situation, but I can see some signals there that saying, okay, we need to rethink what we did and
yeah,
how we are going to continue with the situation in order not to go back to the previous situation of the
yeah.
situation that created these leaders.
I think that's an excellent point, kind of the switch of the pendulum, right? It's when
Mhm.
one party fails, you see another party come in, whether it's from the left or the right, kind of the failure to deliver on what has been promised. One of the candidates that we've been talking about a lot, or one of the presidents we've been talking about a lot in this conversation, has been Nayib Bukele, right? He is one of the most popular leaders, not just in his own country, but across the region. And won his reelection by over 80%. Not a razor thin margin by
Yeah, no.
any definition. Um, but I think he's an interesting character to look at because we've been talking about the narratives and kind of this idea of security. But I think we should also remember that Bukele was part of a left-wing party before starting his own. And
Mhm.
part of this may have been, as Ernesto, you pointed out, that the left is viewed as soft on crime. So when he came in, he started his own party, is now viewed as a member of the right because he's predominantly not the traditional left-right spectrum, but tough on crime. At the same
Yeah.
time, and this is another point you raised, Ernesto, is many times politicians become embedded with some of these criminal organizations. And there's plenty of reporting, not that Bukele wants getting out, but that is well documented by Alvaro and others about the role that his party has had and that he has personally had in negotiating with criminal groups.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
so I guess what do you guys think? Is this really this rightward shift? Is it just the security, or is this really about just a rebuke of whomever was in power? And it just so happened that the last parties in power happened to be of the left, so now we're going to shift to the right? Or is it that every candidate is going to follow Bukele and say, well, I'm just going to be tough on crime, whether I am a left wing or economic populist, shall we say, or a economic conservative. It's not about the traditional left-right economic spectrum, just about the security side of things.
I mean, go ahead, Ernesto.
No, no, no,
Yeah.
please, please.
I mean, I just want to start off by saying that I love this characterization that you put forth, Ernesto, the triangle of if you want to understand Latin American and the Western Hemisphere and its politics in the year 2026, I think thinking of this triangle that you mentioned, like Trump, Bukele, and Milei, really sort of packages it nicely, right? Security, the economy, and then the hegemon to the north. But more to your question, Adam, I do think, and I've mentioned this before, I know that I mentioned that security and the economy are the two factors really driving this. That is not to say that there are not other external factors that are not contributing to this. And I completely agree with Ernesto with what you're saying, that a lot of this is the backlash to whoever was in power. And then this ties into what you were saying, Adam, about is it really a rightward shift? Did the people really go to the polls saying, well, I'm going to vote for a right-wing candidate? Or did they say, I'm just sick of everybody that has been promising me things and it hasn't delivered? Right. So I would absolutely agree that that's also a factor, regardless of whether they're right wing or left wing. People are not cleanly putting Bukele in a box and remembering, right, that he used to be a left wing candidate that started his own party and that he's now considered to be right wing. I also want to throw in Delcy Rodriguez, for example. Like Delcy Rodriguez, still part of this Bolivarian project of very much one of the ideologically still aligned with this 21st century socialist Bolivarianism, right? That was born with Hugo Chavez. But does that really reflect the practices and the policy decisions that she's now making and this alignment that she has with Washington? So I think a lot of what's happening, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes, a lot of what actually happens on the ground is not reflected in the broader narratives that are being perceived by the global public and the international community and that are picked up by the media and that run with them. I mean, perhaps we could touch on this a little bit later because I do want to give Ernesto a chance to respond. But for example, Milei and his total U-turn on China, right? The fact that he's perhaps the greatest supporter of Donald Trump in the region, the most ardent supporter of Donald Trump in the region. And at the same time, I think Argentina, correct me if I'm mistaken, is the one who has amped up their trade with China and developed these closer ties with China more than anybody else in the region, right? So the reality was occurring on the ground, right? Argentina like tightening these relationships, economic relationships, trade relationships with China, while at the same time being the most ardent supporter of the United States ideologically and in terms of its rhetoric. And then we can contrast that to Mexico, which in terms of its trade is very, very aligned with the United States, right? Mexico is entirely dependent on the United States. 80% of exports go to the United States, 40% of imports come from the United States. But at the same time, it's not as ideologically aligned, right? It takes a very sort of like arm's length stance. So I just think it's a paradox that we need to contend with.
Yes, I just want to bring here another point. I really see a transnational movement as well playing like some role here. No, it's not only the pendulum coming and going, but there are uh, these transnational movements building agendas and trying to push for these things to happen. And when I say this, I'm not just saying that this is something related to conservative or far right movements, but the results. I think that they mirror what it's going on in the other. No, and I don't know. And here Spain plays a big role. No, we have like the um, sorry, the Madrid Forum on the one hand, which was created in Spain, just like for Spain, for like a little group, Vox, they are the political party, and then it started to grow, and now we have most of the leaders enrolled, all the leaders of Latin America enrolled in this, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the fourth summit titled "In Defense of Democracy." Uh, Presided by Sanchez, and where Lula, Sheinbaum was there, Petro was there. No, so there are these networks. They are playing a very, very, very important role, important pressure. I think that's something that we also need to consider when we analyze this idea of ideologization, because we also run the risk to think that ideologization is also related to the far right, which is not true. No,
Mhm.
and well, we have been talking about like these leaders that are in the far right because they have won the elections right now, and now we can add Chile, and indeed the next meeting of the Madrid Forum, Foro Madrid, will be in Santiago de Chile in September 2026. So it's not, I mean, we should be like very naive to think that this is just because Chile is going from right to left in a democratic election. There is something else going on here. No? And if we want to take this situation not only in the hemisphere, but go like a little global, well, yes, of course, we have the BRICS on the one hand. We have all the situation with like this far right related even to Israel. There is a lot going on there. And also we need to carefully um, analyze also these elements in order to understand what's going on in Latin America and why it's getting more ideologized.
And Ernesto, to kind of pick up on that, I think that's a really good point. Like when we're seeing it from both sides, but kind of pulling out from what's happening on the politics on the ground, which we're not seeing the left-right swings maybe, but kind of pragmatic politics. But these politics, once it is among politicians, whether at the subnational level or the national level, becoming ideologicalized, right? And being leveraged by different groups in different ways. And I think that's a really important part, right? So you mentioned kind of this triangle where we're talking about security, we're talking about the economy. But when we look at the foreign policy, or at least the international alignment, we're seeing this kind of trajectory of we are a rightward group, even when the driving factors are extremely different. And we saw that, I think, in a lot of ways with kind of the ALBA group as well. It wasn't just what we saw in the past that got those countries to align, that allowed for a left-wing swing, but the countries once, even if the policies they implemented on the ground looked very different, they aligned themselves. One of the things I always think we forget about is, talk about left wing, right wing schisms that didn't make any sense. During COVID, AMLO, a left-wing politician in Mexico,
Mhm.
cuts government subsidies for the poor, while Bolsonaro, a hard right politician in Brazil, revitalizes a lot of the ideas that his predecessors had implemented, left-wing leaders, to respond to the pandemic. Not what we would have expected if we thought, a traditional left-right split. But when it came to the narratives and the alignment internationally,
Mhm.
you saw a very strong, well, AMLO is of the left, Bolsonaro is of the right,
Mhm.
and the alignments that came around those, regardless of the policies implemented on the ground. To kind of build on that, you mentioned some of these transnational networks that are taking place and particularly coming from Spain. I know you also wrote a wonderful piece about a politician from Spain recently coming to Mexico to build out some of those subnational networks. I think it's a really important point. We'll make sure to go ahead and share that in the notes up for this episode as well, so that if you're interested, you can dive into some of the specifics on Spain. But let's go a little bit broader than just talking about kind of some of the Spanish ones. But what other networks are there that are connecting political actors across borders? And does technology facilitate that? Has it made it easier in different ways?
Mhm.
Other networks. Okay, I think I can jump in here. Well, there's a lot of other players, I think, involved in this if we're sort of zooming out. And Ernesto, you're completely right to mention Israel. I think Israel has been one of the external actors that has been most involved in Latin America in the past couple of years. And with everything that happened since October of 2023, I think it's something really worth talking about. And I think it's impossible to disentangle what's been happening with Israel and the ideologicalization and the role of these elected leaders from social media, right? And social media has fundamentally contributed to this sort of rightward and leftward division and the perception that there's a very clean division of who is aligned with Israel versus who is aligned with Palestine, right? And I think social media has really been a large factor in that sense, right? It has democratized these spaces and it has sort of become if you align with Palestine and if you support Palestine, you're automatically a left-wing leader. And if you're somebody that aligns with Israel, then you're automatically a right-wing leader. These are sort of the little categories that the overarching narrative globally of international politics has placed these leaders into. Um, yeah, so I would say that the role of social media, particularly with the Palestinian issue, has been massive, and the role of Israel in the I'm sorry, in the United States certainly, but in Latin America has also been quite significant.
And just to kind of pick up on that a little bit, it's not just Israel, right? We're seeing a real siloing of the narratives that you're hearing on every issue. The number of folks who I've spoken with from Brazil who say the election was stolen. There are facts that is on the ground, it is real. International
Mhm.
observers who are looking at this and trying to be as unbiased as possible are telling us no, there is no false voting. This is not a stolen election. In fact, it's being
Mhm.
stolen by the person in power, if anything, right? Like it doesn't make sense the outside to be able to take over. But we're seeing these very different narratives emerge that really create challenges, I think, in every country that are also, I think, being activated if we're talking about external actors, not just by several external actors, right? Like I think Russia in particular has
Mhm.
an
Yeah.
RT that amplified some of those narratives that are false. We've seen kind of some of the Chinese companies try to, or companies and news groups, same thing, try to foster a positive image of China. But they are very different, right? Sometimes it's targeted to the left, sometimes it's targeted to the right. Um, in my view, I think Russia's view is that it's, not about left or right. It's just can I create chaos and division? Because
Mhm.
that works for fostering some of these divisions that challenge and promote their own ideas. Ukraine, another area where we see very different narratives emerging from the left and the right. Ernesto, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to bring Ukraine and Russia because I think that was another debate that in Latin America was marked by this division between left and right. Now we don't talk about that anymore. So it looks like everything is solved and we forgot about that. And now all the analysis and the look is or the debates are around Israel and Palestine. But I think that that was another thing, and I think that the other external element here is the European Union and how it has also shifted from left to right and from right to left. No, and for example, why the politics of Hungary would at some point be important from Latin America. And it
Mhm.
turned to be absolutely important. It was a flag that we raised because um, the far right lost the government there, no, and the other way about. No, so this kind of stuff, I think that they are like playing also some kind of roles in Latin America that are that in the Americas in general, no, because I mean the situation of Orban here in the United States was huge. So yes, there are a lot of things, and I really like how you put it, Vierelina, no, like this idea that we need to. It's like if I vote for this or that, immediately I have like a list of things that I have to agree with, or that everybody assumes that I agree with. No,
Right.
I think that this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that, and this affects me like personally because I'm a sociologist of political sociologist. I try to criticize everything, and and here media plays a role. It's not only that if I support or not someone, but as soon as I make a critique, I'll be enrolled in the opposite situation.
Yeah.
And at some point, my question is, why do I need to agree with both sides if I really think that sometimes there are mistakes in both sides? No,
Absolutely.
I mean, if I don't want to give any kind of example right now in order to just not to open a door that we are not going to close. But yes, it doesn't mean that if I make a critique to this government, doesn't mean that I fully support the other one and the other way about. And this is something that at some point, of course, we are as analysts and advisors, we have to be very aware of that. But I also think that people need to really think about this. We
Right.
cannot assume that these are two different packages. It's black or white. It's not like that. It doesn't work like this. No, we
Absolutely.
need to be beyond that situation and beyond that dichotomy and probably turn that into a dialectic, that we can
Yeah.
dialogue and we can see pros and cons to create something new.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
I think that's a really interesting point, especially the idea that there are suddenly on the left and right kind of a set of, particularly I think on the foreign policy side, a set of agenda items that you're expected to follow, right? And that's part of this ideologicalization. But because of that kind of set of ideas, I wanted to shift gears to saying what are the risks for countries as this ideologicalization happens, right? I think you're seeing some countries who will align themselves into one group or the other because there are benefits associated with it, right? Um, some of the ALBA countries, for instance, were not particularly left wing, but were needing support from Venezuela's oil kind of at Alba's peak. At the same time, I think you could argue that some of the countries that have swung the furthest to the right have
Mhm.
not done so necessarily pragmatically, but have seen it as an opportunity to ingratiate themselves with the United States.
Mhm.
Um, so what, or impossibly in some of those cases, to try to get support from the United States for domestic political purposes, right? You look at the Bolsonaros in Brazil, for instance, trying to get Trump to weigh in on Brazilian politics. Um, what is the risk of this kind of ideological affinity for countries in the long term? Do you think that this is something that's going to work in their favor, or, I mean, short term, long term? What are the opportunities and risks that these countries face?
You just mentioned one, the internationalization of domestic politics. I think it's really, really dangerous. And we have been through this in Latin America. We need like some to grab some books and read some history and Latin American history. We have been through this, and we know what happened when we try to. I'm not going to. Well, yes, I'm going to do both. I mean, we know what happens when that there is like an explicit influence of the U.S. politics in different regions, but we also know what happens when we try to replicate a system that was successful in another country to a society that is absolutely different.
Right.
No, we can't do that. So I think that that's one of the risks that I see, probably one of the most objective risks that is not very ideological, but it's this. I mean, we need to be careful of how um, how if our domestic politics are if they are permeated by these external powers. This is one of the risks that I see.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely harmful long term in terms of shared goals, right? Shared goals that different regional leaders might have. So, in a previous episode, we talked about shared security goals between the United States and Mexico, right? If this ideologicalization is taken to an extreme with, and this favoritism played by President Trump with certain leaders across the region is taken to an extreme, does this then mean that he is no longer going to collaborate with one of the most important presidents in the region from one of the most important countries politically and economically in the region, Mexico, because she does not align with his views? Right. So taken to the extreme, I think this is detrimental to shared goals, security goals, economic goals. If I don't like to obsess over the United States and Trump's influence over the region because I think that's been overdone and overblown and is not representative of what actually is occurring in Latin America. But if, for example, the United States, in terms of its foreign policy goals, wants to, let's say, counteract China's influence, right? It's not, that is not something that is going to be successful long term if the US president is picking favorites, right? When this is an influence, China's influence is something that is sort of I won't say uniform, but it's something that is appealing to a lot of countries, right? A lot of countries in the region, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, they all have trade with China and they all have diplomatic ties with China. If the United States starts to pick favorites, or if, for example, a new US president comes to power, right? Does that mean that suddenly these ties and these shared goals, economic goals or foreign policy goals dissolve and break down? So I do think that the United States and other leaders in the region need to be careful of taking this ideologicalization to the extreme and playing personalist politics with who it is that I like and who it is that I don't like in the region. On some level, we need to remember that bureaucracies are important and institutions are important, and that we will, for example, the United States will continue to collaborate with Mexico because it's in the best interest of both countries, right? And not refuse to do any of that just because him and President Sheinbaum don't align ideologically or politically, if that makes sense. So I do think this ideologicalization, this polarization can be severely detrimental to shared goals in the region.
And I
Yes,
think,
and I also think, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, I also think that I mean, we don't have, I'm thinking about this project that we have about the twin anniversaries here in 2026, the US independency and the Panama Congress. When we go back to those projects, those were projects, like national projects. No, here we don't have national projects. We have these transnational ideals that we try to replicate on the one hand, and then these ideologization used to win elections, and they pay fruit. I mean, they are winning elections, and they won elections in the past as well. But I don't see like a long-term situation beyond the narrative. No, in the narrative, yes, we want to make Argentina great again. We want to make the US great, America great again, blah, blah, blah. But then what we see in real politics, in like everyday life, it's not that. No, because it's only an empty narrative that is useful to win elections. And
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem.
I think there's two things I want to pick up on with you guys from that. One is that this ingratiation from left to right doesn't always work, right?
Mhm.
Look at who's facing tariffs right now. It's not just countries like Brazil and Mexico who are arguably facing the highest tariffs, but Ecuador is being slapped with tariffs. Costa Rica is being slapped with tariffs. Countries that have sought to align themselves with the United States are still facing some of the consequences that Trump is putting forward globally, but that are impacting the region as well. And even on things that are not necessarily completely accurate, right? Questions about human trafficking and forced labor, not as big of an issue in some countries as others, and yet the countries that are being hit are still facing those challenges. To kind of shift gears a little bit, though, I wanted to also touch on this idea of what can we do, right? What should companies, civil society groups, subnational actors, what should they be doing to ensure that there isn't a these wide swings that end up undermining their ability to engage with other countries, where they're going to face their trade being cut off or access to the companies that they've been working with in the past, markets they've been working with in the past, just because of a single election. What can be done to ensure that that alignment isn't the only factor shaping the relationships between countries?
I mean, I do think actions speak louder than words. And as much as I am not a fan of Javier Milei in Argentina, I do think he did the right thing by switching his position on China, right? He went from calling them assassins and whatever else in during his election campaign to then suddenly saying, oh, they're a very valuable trade partner, this and that, because he knows that the Argentine economy cannot subsist and maintain itself afloat if it does not continue to have this partnership and this trade and these economic ties to China, right? And I think he's been very good at sort of playing both of these hegemons off of each other. And the one who is benefiting there is Argentina, right? He secured this monetary package from the United States, these $40 billion, and he's also increased his trade with China. So I think actually, if I were an elected leader, I think what Milei is doing is incredibly beneficial to the people that he has made promises to, and that is the Argentine public, in many ways. I think Claudia Sheinbaum is also somebody who has walked this fine line of maintaining the integrity of her own politics and her own ideologies and of Mexican sovereignty, but at the same time continuing to collaborate with the United States. So I think these actions by the actions taken by these leaders really say a lot and can, despite these sort of this backlash and these waves of right and left, their actions can really do a lot to safeguard the prosperity of their people and to yeah deliver on the promises that they made during their elections and their campaigns.
Yes, I appreciate that, Vierelina. I also think that that's probably like a more general thing that I try to, I mean, I always tell to myself, but I think it's important that we shouldn't buy the narratives as they come, just like them. No, like it is a critical acceptance of what they say or what's going on. No? I see like a huge power there. I think that the if NGOs, non-state actors, international organizations, even these networks, they start to be more critical and try to think the real world in a different perspective. But I'm just talking about looking at the facts, looking at what's going on, looking at what we understand by being successful, by a successful policy or a successful election. I think that we live in a moment that we need to go beyond oversimplifications, go beyond like this religious affiliation to political parties or to ideologies. I think it's extremely complex because, again, we go back to the idea that everything has to do with opposition, black, white, good, bad, God, and the devil. No, there's not possible. Well, yes, there is a possibility of something different, of something in between that depends on us. I know that it may sound like a little abstract or spiritual, I don't know, but I think it's the only way to go. I really think it's the only way to go. If we are not critical with our reality, if we do not see what's going on out there, and if we only embrace narratives as they come, it will be difficult to overcome this situation.
I think that point about black and white is an excellent one about it's not ever as simple as we point that out to be, right? Good and evil
Listen.
is not the reality of politics for the most part. I'd also just add in a couple of points here, which is not just looking at the president as the focal point of a country, right? As you guys both noted, most of these elections have been razor thin. So what does this look like, not just in the moment, but looking longer term? How can you engage with civil society groups? How can you engage with other companies in country? How can you engage with the municipality level in different countries? Because those you see far less of these kind of radical swings where it's defined by ideology. Um, you're less like the mayor of Sao Paulo. I'm not going to use Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is a big enough in the same way that New
Mhm.
York is, it's a national stage, right? People think of that as a stepping stone. But the governor of Minas Gerais in Brazil, huge state, extremely powerful, but not necessarily going to be viewed in that same international left-right spectrum in the same way. The mayor of a small town in Oklahoma isn't, they may be in a Republican leaning area, they might be Democrat, they might be Republican, but the reality is that they have to get things done, right?
Mm.
And I think there's a lot of ways, and the bureaucracy is in the same way. They outlast presidential candidates. I think we should be looking at where are those bridges that can be built, um, because those are the ones that last beyond an election cycle, and those relationships last far deeper than the relationship between any two presidents in the region.
Absolutely
Yes,
agree.
and we have seen, I mean, we have seen that, how powerful local politics is,
Mhm.
and how within the institutional frameworks, how some municipalities or local governments have been able to go beyond the state in order to create a good relationship with another actor out there. No, we analyze this in our Beyond the Belgor, beyond, oh, sorry, Beyond the Bell Road project. That it's something that we are trying to focus how international politics starts in local with local politics, and it's not something nice to say. It's really happening. I think that's something that's a good way to go, and for good and for bad, no, because in my article about Ayuso, it's exactly the opposite, no, like this president of an autonomous community in Spain coming to Mexico and uh, going beyond the national government to start some relationship with some local leaders, no, in order to strengthen like this conservative perspective and try to this I don't know, to have like some kind of electoral result there. No? So I think we need to keep an eye on that as well. No? We as analysts, we need to keep an eye on that, but also only these local governments should start learning how powerful they are and they can be.
To kind
Yeah, I would just jump in with my 2 cents here. I would say that I don't want to overblow our role as political scientists or analysts because we come from a very privileged position. But I would say that, echo what Ernesto was saying, to try to deconstruct these binaries, right? These very entrenched binaries, and to be critical of the fact that, hey, you can be part of the Bolivarian 21st century socialist movement and still be aligned with Donald Trump. You can be religious. I love that you brought up the role of religion, Ernesto. You can, to be religious in Latin America doesn't automatically mean that you're right wing, right? When we start talking and analyzing and criticizing this and historicizing it and talking about the role of liberation theology and how it actually aligned with the poor and the left wing insurgencies in Latin America. When we start to I think make this something more than just a black and white differentiation, I think our role there as strategists, as political scientists, is really important, and that's something that we can do in our everyday, right? And you mentioned the role of technology, Adam, using these platforms, using social media, using YouTube, Instagram, our writing to sort of deconstruct these binaries, I think is also something that we can tangibly do in the day to day.
Something just to kind of tie a bow on this before asking you guys for some final comments is that came up both in when we're talking about how the electorate's voting, but also your solutions is pragmatism.
Mhm.
Voters are voting to get something done. If we want to see results, I think in foreign policy, that has to be central to a lot of this is avoiding this ideologicalization and the black and white spectrum, the silos that we've created, in favor of pragmatic engagement where it matters, where it helps, and understanding that most actors in the region are also being pragmatic in their approach. Sometimes those narratives are about shaping the response to themselves as well. So the binary creates a lot of challenges, I think, for companies engaging in the region who say, "Oh, this is a radical shift and we're not seeing things." Let's see where we can engage. Let's see where we can partner with people on the ground to have pragmatic results. Just to wrap it up, any final words from either of you?
Ernesto, you wanna?
No, I mean, I think that ideologization is one of the biggest challenges that we have nowadays, no? And I see it, it's something that we didn't talk about, but I have sometimes I feel that diplomacy has, I mean, became a venue where we only discuss ideological narratives. Uh, And you see, it's like kind of funny at some point, no? Like these people with their microphones, uh, like telling things to each other, say, okay, this is a big international forum. What are you doing? I mean, what are you doing? But it has like shaped all the ways of doing politics at some point. And I think that this is one of the most important challenges that we have. Like to go beyond that, as I think Vierelina put it in a beautiful way, like this idea of deconstructing binaries. I think that that's something, and sometimes we need to understand that we are part of that construction. It's not something that is outside ourselves. We are part of this, and we can contribute to make those binaries stronger, or we can also start to deconstruct them in order to create a more, I don't know if the word is rational but a word that we can better understand in order to solve some of the situations that uh, are out there, because at the end this is about people's lives.
Yeah, I think my main takeaways have a lot to do with what you were saying. This is about people's lives. It's about pragmatism. So people don't go to the polls to vote ideologically as much as they go to the polls to vote for what their reality is going to look like next week, the next year, a month from now. So my main takeaways would be to think about what it is that's driving constituents and what the pressing issues that Latin Americans themselves have when they go to vote for somebody and when they're living their day-to-day lives. I mentioned security, I mentioned the economy. We also talked about this backlash. I think these are all factors that we need to keep in mind. People are sick and tired of these empty promises, and that's why we've seen so much of a backlash and so much this rise in popularity of these outsider candidates. So for me, I think that's just something to think about, and I think those are the main takeaways that I would mention.
Awesome. Well, Ernesto, Vierelina, thank you so much for joining us on Que Pasa today. For everyone who's tuned in, please turn into our next episode. We're going to be focusing on what the energy transition and mining looks like in the Americas. We look forward to having you on our next episode as well. Ernesto, Vierelina, thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.